Section 28 of T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Colleen McMahon. T. DeWitt Talmage as I Knew Him by Thomas DeWitt Talmage. Milestone 17, Part 2. I was installed in the First Presbyterian Church in Washington on October 23, 1895. My first sermon in the new pulpit in Washington was preached to a crowded church, with an overflow of over 3,000 persons in the street outside. The text of my sermon was "All Heaven is Looking On." In a few days, by exchange of my Brooklyn property, I had obtained the house 1402 Massachusetts Avenue in Washington for my home. It had at one time been the Spanish legation and was in a delightful part of the city. Shortly after my arrival in Washington, I received my first introduction at the White House, with my daughters, to Mrs. Cleveland. Our reception was cordial and gracious in the extreme. I had engaged a suite of rooms at the Arlington Hotel for a year. We remained there till our lease was up before entering our new home. There was a desire among members of the congregation of the First Presbyterian Church to have me preach at the morning as well as the evening services. With 3 ministers attached to one church, there was some difficulty in the arrangement of the sermons. Eventually it was decided that I should preach morning and evening. In 1896 I made an extensive lecturing tour, in which I discussed my impressions of the world trip I had recently made. The world was getting better in spite of contrasting opinions from men who had thought about it. God never launched a failure. In 1897 I made an appeal for aid for the famine in India. I always believed it was possible to evangelize India. My life in Washington was not different from its former course. I had known many prominent people of this country, and some of the great men of other lands. I had known all the presidents of the United States since Buchanan. I had known Mr. Gladstone, all the more prominent men in the bishoprics, and in high commercial, financial, and religious position. I had been presented to royalty in more than one country. Legislatures in the North and South have adjourned to give me reception. The Earl of Kintore, a Scottish peer, entertained us at his house in London in 1879. I found his family delightful Christian people, and the Countess and their daughters are very lovely. The Earl presided at 2 of my meetings. He took me to see some of his midnight charities, one of them called the House of Lords and the other the House of Commons, both of them asylums for old and helpless men. We parted about 2 o'clock in the morning on the streets of London. As we bade each other good-bye, he said, "Send me a stick of American wood, and I will send you a stick." His arrived in America, and is now in my possession, a shepherd's crook. But before the cane I purchased for him reached Scotland, the good Earl had departed this life. I was not surprised to hear of his decease. I said to my wife in London, "We will never see the Earl again in this world. He is ripe for heaven, and will soon be taken." He attended the House of Lords during the week, and almost every Sabbath preached in some chapel or church. I shall not forget the exciting night I met him. I was getting out of a carriage at the door of a church in London where I was to lecture, when a ruffian struck at me, crying, "He that believeth not shall be damned." The scoundrel's blow would have demolished me but for the fact that a bystander put out his arm and arrested the blow. From that scene I was ushered into the anteroom of the church, where the Earl of Kintore was awaiting my arrival. From that hour we formed a friendship. He had been a continuous reader of my sermons, and that fact made an introduction easy. I have from him 5 or 6 letters. Lord and Lady Aberdeen had us at their house in London in the summer of 1892. Most gracious and delightful people they are. I was to speak at Haddo House, their estate in Scotland, at a great philanthropic meeting, but I was detained in St. Petersburg, Russia, by an invitation of the Emperor, and could not get to Scotland in time. Glad am I that the Earl is coming to Canada to be Governor General. He and the Countess will do Canada a mighty good. They are on the side of God and righteousness and the Church. Since his appointment, for he intimated at Aberdeen, Scotland, when he called upon me, that he was to have an important appointment, I have had opportunity to say plauditory things of them in vast assemblages in Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, London, and Grimsby Park. In a scrapbook in which I put down, hurriedly perhaps, but accurately, my impressions of various visits to the White House during my 4 years' pastorate in Washington, I find some notes that may be interesting. I transmit them to the printed page exactly as I find them written on paper. May 1st, 1896. Had a long talk this afternoon with Mrs. Cleveland at Woodley. I always knew she was very attractive, but never knew how wide her information was on all subjects. She had her 3 children brought in, and the 2 elder ones sang Easter songs for me. Mrs. Cleveland impresses me as a consecrated Christian mother. She passes much of her time with her children, and seems more interested in her family than in anything else. The First Lady of the land, she is universally admired. I took tea with her, and we talked over many subjects. She told me that she had joined the church at 14 years of age. Only 2 joined the church that day, a man of 80 years old and herself. She was baptized then, not having been baptized in infancy. She said she was glad she had not been baptized before because she preferred to remember her baptism. She said she did not like the great crowds attending the church then, because she did not like to be stared at as the president's wife. But I told her she would get used to that after a while. She said she did not mind being stared at on secular occasions, but objected to it at religious service. She said she had long ago ceased taking the Holy Communion at our church because of the fact that spectators on that day seemed peculiarly anxious to see how she looked at the communion. My first meeting with Mrs. Cleveland was just after her marriage. She was at the depot in her carriage to see Miss Rose Cleveland, the president's sister, off on the train. Dr. Sunderland introduced me at that time, when I was just visiting Washington. Mrs. Cleveland invited me to take a seat in her carriage. I accepted the invitation, and we sat there some time talking about various things. I saw, as everyone sees who converses with her, that she is a very attractive person, though brilliantly attired, unaffected in her manner as any mountain lass. March 3rd, 1897. Made my last call this afternoon on Mrs. Cleveland. Found her amid a group of distinguished ladies and unhappy at the thought of leaving the White House, which had been her home off and on for nearly 8 years. Her children have already gone to Princeton, which is to be her new home. She is the same beautiful, unaffected, and intelligent woman that she has always been since I formed her acquaintance. She is an inspiration to anyone who preaches, because she is such an intense listener. Her going from our church here will be a great loss. It is wonderful that a woman so much applauded and admired should not have been somewhat spoiled. More complimentary things have been said of her than of any living woman. She invited me to her home in Princeton, but I do not expect ever to get there. Our pleasant acquaintance seems to have come to an end. Washington society will miss this queen of amiability and loveliness. February 4th, 1897. Had one of my talks with President Cleveland. As I congratulated him on his coming relief from the duties of his absorbing office, he said, "Yes, I am glad of it, but there are so many things I wanted to accomplish which have not been accomplished." Then he went into extended remarks about the failure of the Senate to ratify the arbitration plan. He said that there had been much work and anxiety in that movement that had never come to the surface, how they had waited for cablegrams, and how at the same time, though he had not expressed it, he had a presentiment that through the inaction of the Senate the splendid plan for the pacification of the world's controversies would be a failure. He dwelt much upon the Cuban imbroglio, and said that he had told the Committee on Foreign Relations that if they waited until spring they had better declare war, but that he would never be responsible for such a calamity. He said that he had chosen Princeton for his residence because he would find there less social obligation and less demand upon his financial resources than in a larger place. He said that in all matters of national as well as individual importance, it was a consolation to him to know that there was an overwhelming providence. When I congratulated him upon his continuous good health, notwithstanding the strain upon him for the 8 years of his past and present administration, he said, "Yes, I am a wonder to myself. The gout that used to distract me is almost cured, and I am in better health than when I entered office." He accounted for his good health by the fact that he had occasionally taken an outing of a few days on hunting expeditions. I said to him, "Yes, you cannot think of matters of state while out shooting ducks." He answered, "No, I cannot, except when the hunting is poor and the ducks do not appear." May 21st, 1896. This morning when I entered President Cleveland's room at the White House, he said, "Good morning. I have been thinking of you this morning." The fact is, he had under consideration the recall of a minister plenipotentiary from a European government. I had an opportunity of saying something about a gentleman who was proposed as a substitute for the foreign embassy, and the President said my conversation with him had given him a new idea about the whole affair. And I think it kept the President from making a mistake that might have involved our government in some entanglement with another nation. The President read me a long letter that he had received on the subject. I felt that my call had been providential, although I went to see him merely to say goodbye before he went away on his usual summer trip to Gray Gables, Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts. The President is in excellent health, although he says he much needs an outing. He is very fond of his children, and seemed delighted to hear of the good time I had with them at Woodley. When I told how Ruth and Esther sang for me, he said he could not stand hearing them sing, as it was so touching it made him cry. I told him how the baby, Marian, looked at me very soberly and scrutinizingly as long as I held her in my arms, but when I handed her to her mother, the baby, feeling herself very safe, put out her hands to me and wanted to play. But what a season of work and anxiety it had been to the President, important question after question to be settled. March 1st, 1897. I have this afternoon made my last call on President Cleveland. With Dr. Sunderland and the officers of our church, I went to the White House to bid our retiring President goodbye. Notwithstanding appointments he had made, Thurber, his private secretary, informed us that the President could not see us because of a sudden attack of rheumatism. But after Thurber had gone into the President's room, he returned, saying that the President would see Dr. Sunderland and myself. Indeed, afterwards he saw all our church officers, but he could not move from his chair. His doctor had told him that if he put his foot to the floor he would not be able to attend the inauguration of Major McKinley on the following Thursday. After Dr. Sunderland and the officers of the church had shaken hands for departure, the President said to me, "Doctor, remain. I want to see you." The door closed. He asked me if I had followed the Chinese immigration bill that was then under consideration. We discussed it fully. The President read to me the veto which he was writing. He stated to me his objection to the bill. Our conversation was intimate, but somewhat saddened by the thought that perhaps we might not meet again. With an invitation to come and see him at Princeton, we parted. During a conversation of an earlier period at the White House, I congratulated the President upon his improved appearance since returning from one of his hunting expeditions. "Oh, yes," he said, "I cannot get daily exercise in Washington. It is impossible. So I am compelled to take these occasional outings. I approached the city on my return with a feeling that work must be pulled down over me like a nightcap." And as he said this he made the motion as of someone putting a cap over his head. I congratulated him on the effect of his proclamation on the Monroe Doctrine, as it would set a precedent, and really meant peace. He agreed with me, saying yes, but they blame me very much for the excitement I have caused in business circles, and the failures consequent. But no one failed who was doing a legitimate business, only those collapsed who were engaged in unwarranted speculations. I wish more of those people would fail. "Mr. President," I said, "I do not want to pry into state secrets, but I would like to know, how many ducks did you shoot?" He laughed and said 11. The papers said 13. Indeed, the country papers, before I began to shoot, said that I had shot 120. I spoke of the brightness and beauty of his children again. I remarked that the youngest one, then 4 months old, had the intelligence of a child a year old, and the President said, "Yes, she is a great pleasure to us, and seems to know everything." March 3rd, 1896. Started from Washington for the great home missionary meeting to be held in Carnegie Hall, New York. President Cleveland to preside. We left on the 11 o'clock train by Pennsylvania Railroad. I did not go to the President's private car until we had been some distance on our way, although he told me when I went in that he had looked for me at the depot, and I might as well have been in his car all the way. No one was with him except Mrs. Cleveland and his private secretary, Mr. Thurber, who was also one of my church. We had an uninterrupted conversation. The servants and guards were at the front end of the car, and we were at the rear. I asked the President if he found it possible to throw off the cares of office for a while. He laughed and said, "They call a trip of this kind a vacation." Then, with a countenance of sudden gravity, he added, "We no sooner get through one great question than another comes." It made me think of the tension on the President's mind at that time. There was the Venezuelan question. There were suggestions of war with England. And then there was the Cuban matter, with suggestions of war with Spain. And all the time the overshadowing financial questions. During our conversation the President referred to the conditions ever and anon inflicted upon him by newspaper misrepresentations, particularly those of inebriety, of domestic quarrels, of turning Mrs. Cleveland out of doors at night so that she had to flee for refuge to the house of Dr. Sunderland, my pastoral associate, passing the night there, and then the reports that his children were deaf and dumb or imbecile, when he knew I had seen them and considered them the brightest and healthiest children I had known. All these attacks and falsehoods concerning the President and his family I saw hurt him as deeply as they would any of us, but he is in a position which does not allow him to make reply. I assured him that he was only in the line of misrepresentation that had assailed all the presidents, George Washington more violently than himself, and that the words cynicism, jealousy, political hatred, and diabolism in general would account for all. I do think, however, that the factories of scandal have been particularly busy with our beloved President. They were running on extra time. If I were asked who among the mighty men at Washington has most impressed me with the elements of power, I would say Grover Cleveland. June 25, 1896. It seems now that Major McKinley of Canton, Ohio, will be elected President of the United States. I was in Canton about 3 weeks ago and called at Major McKinley's house. He was just starting from his home to call on me. He presided at the first lecture I delivered in Canton in 1871. On my recent visit he recalled all the circumstances of that lecture, remembering that he went to my room afterwards in the hotel and had a long talk with me, which he said made a deep impression upon him. My visit at Canton 3 weeks ago was to lecture. Major McKinley attended and came upon the platform afterwards to congratulate me. He is a Christian man and as genial and lovable a man as I ever met. September 21, 1897. Had a most delightful interview with President McKinley in the White House. I congratulated him on the peaceful opening of his administration. He said, "Yes, I hope it is not the calm before a storm." He said that during the last 6 weeks at least 500,000 of people had passed before him, and they all gave signs of their encouragement. Especially, he said, the women and children looked and acted as though they expected better times. The President looked uncommonly well. I told him that during the past summer I had traveled in many of the States, and that from the people everywhere I gathered hopeful feelings. I told him that they were expecting great prosperity would come to the country through his administration. Of course, these are merely scraps torn from old notebooks, but I cannot help commending the value of first impressions of the first-hand reports which are made in this way. There is in the unadorned picture of any incident in the past a sort of hallowed character that no ornate frame can improve. So the pages of these recollections are but a string of impressions torn from old notebooks and diaries. From scrapbooks and other sources, some other person may set up the last milestones of my journey through life, and think other things of enough importance to add to the furlongs I have already traveled, and I give permission to add that biography to this autobiography. Signed, T. DeWitt Talmage. End of section 28. Recording by Colleen McMahon.